I don't know why, but the blinds aren't coming in, so I apologize. For those of you watching, I'm sure that you're just using most of the voice, right? I haven't done any like hand gestures, right? I have received some comments this semester, so I really appreciate you guys coming in when you want to have a question, going through the live chat. I did get a couple emails about reviews. I already have 11 papers to grade today, November 12th. So by the end of today, I'm gonna have so many papers to grade. I'm gonna try and get them graded as soon as possible so we can discuss everyone's grade before the weekend, so we can see where everyone's at. So because of that, I did get some questions about sort of last minute revisions or last minute sort of like reviews. That window is already passed, right? But make sure that you turn in a paper. Even if you don't get the best grade on the paper, right, you're still in the A range. That's the whole point of this, right? That you want to make sure that you do a paper. If you don't do a paper, it's very unlikely that you even pass the class. If you do a paper, you're still in, because I institute what's called a grade floor, you're still in sort of the A range, right? Because I have a 1 point gap, right? So if you turn in a paper that discusses the 3 articles and is, a 1 sentence onto the 5th page, if you really just turn that in by 11:59 tonight, because when it actually clicks over to midnight, it won't submit. It won't allow you to submit it. So just make sure you turn it in, right? Proofread. Even if you don't do an excellent job on the paper, you're still going to do well enough that you can still be in an A range. Right? We can still work with you on the AB range of your grade. And the blinds are coming down, so I apologize. It's going to be in my eyes, so it's going to be a little distracting. We didn't finish chapter 14 in the last lecture. So I'm going to tell you now, make sure you do the paper. I'm going to tell you at the end, make sure you do the paper. So let's go into 14 and 15, and we'll see where we're at. For those of you doing pretty good on the first 3 exams, make sure you turn in your paper. I will tell you on, let's say Saturday, if you are in the A range and you can sort of redirect your effort somewhere else, right? That's an option for you. Now, I'm going to get a lot of questions about this, so I dropped the lowest exam. If you don't take one of the exams, that's a 0, right? So that's going to be the one I drop. But if you've done well on the first 3, you can afford to drop the 4th exam. They are all weighted the same, right? There's no difference. I fixed some of it. I still have to fix a few more things. But when you're doing your grade calculation Saturday, what you should see is, because I cut the number of assignments in half, right? That I didn't really want 10 assignments. I wanted 5 assignments. I don't like you guys doing work. The quizzes I assign, I like you guys studying and learning how to study in your groups. And unfortunately, there's no social interaction here. But that's usually a big part of being an undergraduate, is learning how to accumulate knowledge quickly. So I'm going to double the points that the assignments are worth. You should see that in the next few days. It's not really functioning the way that I would like, because it's keeping you at your points while doubling the points, which makes it seem like you have a lower grade. You should see that. I'm going to go back through and fix all of that. All you have to do, because even though there are more than 100 points possible, this course is out of 100 points, right? So you just count up your points. Don't worry about the percentage that it has, because the percentage is actually going to be a little bit lower, right? There were 20.5 available on the exam, but I only, 20 is full, right? 20 is 100%. So I gave you a little extra credit in every single exam. So instead of trying to figure out, okay, percentage out of this, right? Just add them all up, and that should give you a good idea of your grade. And I will actually show you, I can't do it on this computer because of limitations on software, right? But I will post a video of a screen share, and it's going to be the student view, my student view of the grades. And I'm going to show you, okay, this is what your grade looks like, and this is how you calculate your grade, just in case there are any questions this weekend. So on Saturday, when you're looking at it, you should see a video on this YouTube channel that tells you how to, like, shows you a visual aid of how to look at your grade. There's just no screen share on YouTube live chat right now. So I'll have to do a screen share only. It's kind of a confusing process, but it's not that difficult on my home laptop. The other part is that we do have an exam. The way that my exam works is it's going to open Sunday before finals week, right? So I cannot assign anything the last week of the semester, but on Sunday before finals week, all the way through, I want to say Thursday, so you have 5 days to take this exam. It's the same exam, right? But that's going to give you a finals window. Once you're done, right, that's everything, right? So On Friday, I think I have to submit grades during finals week, right? So when you're finishing the semester, if you don't like where you're at this weekend, talk to me, right? Email me. We can get into the chat on Web Campus. There are a lot of options. So just make sure that you're reaching out and saying, hey, I think my grade should be better, or this doesn't seem to be corrected, or I didn't do everything I was supposed to do. How can I fix that? Now, the first thing is you can go back and do any assignment you didn't get full credit on, right? You can go back. And I want that there because that's going to solve a lot of problems. Solve a lot of issues about what can I do, right? Make sure you go back and you do everything except the paper. I won't accept late papers. I have a ton of work at the end of the semester, so there's just not enough time for me to really give you an open window. The papers are due today. If they're not in today, you get a 0, right? This is one of the rare times I'm going to be very hardline stance on this. Just because there's so much to do, and I really want to connect with the students who are putting in the work, right? This is the trick, right? Today, make sure you do a paper. If you're not where you're at, go back and fix the assignments, but that is, right, essentially 40% of your grade, that your effort will determine your outcome, right? The more you work on the paper, the more you work on these assignments, that's 40% of your grade that you can really get as close to perfect as possible. I'm going to give you a couple of percentage because of the exam difficulties in an online exam in a class, in a hybrid class like this. So you can really be in a good position where you only need 30 of the 60% of the exam, right? You could get half credit on all of the exams and still pass the class. So I'm really setting you up for success if you put in the effort. Because of that, if you don't do all of the assignments and the paper, there will be no opportunity for a discussion what you can do about your grade afterwards, right? Do a paper, do all the assignments, and then if you're still in a window where you're like, okay, I'm like 1% off, then we can have a larger discussion about that. But if you don't do the assignments in the paper, then there's no possibility of making it up some other way, right? Those are requirements for any type of extra credit at the end of the semester, if there's going to be, right? And those would be special exceptions if, right? Some of us have been very sick this semester, or some of us have been dealing with a lot of issues, right? This is a hybrid course, so maybe you just aren't suited for an online education and you paid for an in-person class and then they didn't give you a classroom. So maybe that's something we can work on. We can figure out a way to go that process, right? So that being said, let's get into lectures. I am a little behind, not a great deal, so make sure you're opening We the People chapter 14. We're going to do chapter 14, the last couple slides, and then we're going to go right into chapter 15. When you're looking at chapter 14, right, where we left off, where we sort of finished this, was this privatization issue. We talked about it, right? Government outsourcing is more and more common. There's actually a book by Suzanne Mettler called The Submerged State. And that text talks about how if you are a government agency, you want to privatize because then the blame will go on the private company, right? If the company's not doing well or it's not doing the service that's being paid for, you blame the company. And that takes blame away from, it takes accountability and blame away from the elected officials, right? That's a good way to sort of shift blame and say, it's not us, it's the company, right? And that's one aspect. The other part is that it has always been argued that privatization saves money, but your text makes this sort of argument that there's no evidence for that. There's no evidence that privatization saves government money. So why are we doing it, right? Do we want more companies involved in government work? And remember, this is different. This is not, we talked about the Postal Service as a government corporation. That's not privatization. A government corporation is a very specific government entity where it has to raise its own money for its services it's providing, and it can't borrow money except from the federal government and has to pay it back, and it can't have any profits, or those profits have to go to the federal government. So when we're talking about this, right, remember, privatization means the government paying or allowing a private company to provide some service, right? And when we talk about like bail bonds or penalties or fees in the courthouse, right? There's a John Oliver, whatever his show is called, like This Week or whatever his satire show is, he really does break this down for you. I'm sure there's a clip out there where these private companies are saying, we're not going to charge you anything, government. We're going to push all of those charges onto the individuals who are involved. So if you get a speeding ticket and it's $100, the private company says, okay, we'll take account of that, but we'll treat it as a collection, which means it starts getting interest immediately. And there are no regulations on interest, so it might be problematic. So when you have something like that, when you start blending things together, that's going to be an issue. Really? Okay. Okay, so hold on one second, because I bet you I can find it, and then I'll explain why I can find it more easily. You're not doing anything wrong. So make sure you go to the library website. It's just library.unov.edu. And then, I apologize for the delay, but the search engine is very different. And they changed the search engine for the library a while ago. In the library system, they changed the algorithm. So it looks at the words, and then it tries to bring up relevance. So you can't see this in the live stream, but if you go to UNLV, library.unov.edu, and just type in how likely is the worst case scenario, the first article that pops up will be the appropriate article, right? The Anderson and Rees piece. I hate this, it's very frustrating. If you copy and then paste the entire citation into the library website, it won't bring it up for some reason. So just find the words that are like unique, right? So I typed in how likely is the worst case scenario, and that brought up the article. Unfortunately, I don't know why they changed the algorithm, because it used to be if you put in a citation, it was like, oh, I recognize this. It doesn't do that anymore. It does relevant terms. Like it's looking at like what terms are relevant in the article title and in the what you searched, even though the exact match would be a better search bar. It doesn't do exact match, it does relevant words. So when you're looking at the search, right, if you're like, oh, it didn't come up, try and just type in like legalization of recreational marijuana. What are the most unique terms in that? But for this one, if you just type in how likely is the worst case scenario in the university library website, you should see it. And hopefully I answered your question. So I just brought it up. Let me see if I can open it. I don't want to tell you. So make sure you go into the JSTOR. JSTOR is better. It functions a little better. Yeah, mine didn't have a problem. I don't know if it's because you're opening it on. But hold on. Let me do something. Let me just. I apologize for those of you who are sort of like not watching this live, but if you haven't written the paper and you're having trouble finding it, let me just do something that maybe ease all of this faster. I'll just upload it. Come on. Okay, so now for those of you who are watching the live stream right now, go into, if you can't get it, I just uploaded it to Web Campus. So if you're like, for whatever reason, the website's not working, I did upload it to Web Campus. It's just called Anderson and Rees. So I believe that should fix the problem for those of you who are having an issue like finding it. I appreciate you guys updating me too. All right, so that article is there, all the articles in there. Also, okay, so you have to use all three articles, right? Remember, so here's the thing. I don't care about the validity of the larger literature, right? There's a ton of literature on this. You're not citing all of that literature. Also, you're trying to look at these, like it would be as if you came to three people and these are the three arguments they give you, and then you were trying to decide logically if legalization were to benefit you or your community or to be at the detriment of you and your community, right? So you need all three articles. One, all three articles have to be involved. And in the paper prompt, it's very clear that all three articles need to be involved, because most of the grade is you demonstrating that you can read an article, a journal article, and synthesize that into your own language, right? That's a big part of the grade is, I read this and this is what it means to me. And even if you're wrong a little, if you're like, these are the words that they said, and this is what I mean, I'm gonna explain to you, okay, here's where you made a mistake. And that's gonna have a very minor impact on your grade, right? If you misunderstand a few things here or there in the article, but you use your own words and you discuss all three articles, that's still a good paper. If you don't discuss all three articles, then that's going to cause a major damage to your paper, right? And because the articles are so short, right, intentionally, I found three very short articles. That was part of the thing. I looked at page length as I was doing this, right? I tried to make this as compact as possible. So if you're actually writing into that 5th page, there's no way that you can really sort of stay on topic on those articles with just 1 or 2. If you're just doing 1 or 2 of the articles, you're probably going to end up including other information. You're going to start making claims that aren't in the articles, right? A lot of the papers I've read, they're like, oh, here's a claim that I'm making, right? We all know this, right? We all know that younger people are more likely to use it than older. There's no evidence there, right? And that might be true, but there's no evidence there. Only discuss the things in the articles. And if you're only discussing the things in the articles to make your argument, you're going to need all 3 to really get that argument through, right? So make sure you're including all 3. Make sure you read all 3, right? It shouldn't take you that long. And really look for the things, right? You can be biased. I don't care if you're biased, right? That's something you can do. You can decide beforehand, I'm going to be for or against. That's something that happens a lot, actually, when we look at research. People just decide what we call a priori, that they're going to decide beforehand that they like a specific side, or they want to be on a specific side. If you want to do that, look for the things that support your side in these articles. That's how politics works. You look for the things that support you and you ignore the things that you don't, right? I'm a political scientist. I want to take as much in as possible, but for you to get a grade in this paper, you can pick a side beforehand and say, okay, this supports what I like, this supports what I like. And you can pick out those things, but you need to read all 3 and pick things from all 3 of them, because they're not talking about the same thing. That's the other thing is, for those of you who have already done the paper, I apologize, but for those who are still working on it, one of the articles talks about a drug control regime, right? International drug control regime, right? And the sort of hypocrisy of that aspect, right? About different standards on different levels of government. But some of them talk about casualties, like how many deaths will there be? How likely is drunk driving to occur, right? They're talking about different aspects and what is really important. And remember, there's always going to be around this idea of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, right? That states have rights. And obviously this wasn't discussed in the Constitution. They weren't talking about marijuana use in the Constitution. So if the government has a supremacy clause, but it says anything not in the Constitution goes to the states, and the states have the 10th Amendment protecting themselves that way, that's a larger government debate. And that's really what I want you to talk about is, should we change it legally because of its impact? And should we change it because of the government should be allowed to do that, right? Those are 2 arguments that you can make, right? And make sure that you're doing it in a non-normative way. I know you showed in that language, but make sure you're saying, here is why I believe they should be changing, or it should be legal, or it should be criminalized because of the negative impact or positive impact, right? No moral arguments. Moral arguments aren't part of these articles, so make sure you're sticking to the evidence. Okay, so we did get a bit of an aside. Hopefully that answered all your questions. That article is up. I checked recently, so all the articles should be up. If you're not finding it when you post it, remember the search engine is different in the library website for some reason. Okay, so hopefully I answered everyone's question. Let's get back to chapter 14 in bureaucratic reform. We just talked about privatization. Okay, no other questions. So now we're going to talk about administrative accountability. And I talked to you last class about this idea, this principal agent problem. A bureaucrat is an agent. They work for someone, like the principal, right? Principal, right? With an AL, right? Not a moral or value with an LE, right? But principal. When you have a principal and they're telling an agent what to do, right? In the same way that your boss tells you what to do, if you're very good at your job, you might think, oh, I know this is what he wants, but the way that he's telling me to do it isn't going to work. It's not going to be effective, right? Your boss might tell you, and I worked in food service, right? Your boss might tell you to like clean off an oven, and you might be like, oh yeah, but just use soap and water. And you might be like, that's not going to get off all of this burnt in stuff, right? I need agents. I need to heat it up, right? Right. Some of you who worked in this, right, you have special expertise. And I'm sure all of you have a job where you have special expertise. And what you might think in your mind is, I know what he wants or she wants. I know how to get what they want, but I can't do it the way they're telling me to do it, right? And this is part of that administrative accountability, is that you might do something different because you have the expertise, and you'd be like, okay, I think I know what you want. The problem is the executive may not want you to do it that way. It may not be about whether or not it's more efficient. It might be that violates the preferences of the principal, right? The principal decides the preferences. So because of that, right, the president is the chief executive. They're in control of all the bureaucracy. All federal bureaucracy is controlled by the president. And so when you have that go through, right, there has to be some accountability on the bureaucracy, right? How do you have accountability? Now it's difficult. I would explain why it's difficult because all the expertise is with the bureaucrats, right? But on the other end, the executive has a lot of his own staffing that can really do part of this. And so because of that, any policy decision or any behavior that would change the Federal Register, we talked about the Federal Register last one, anything that would change the rules, it has to pass through the White House. The White House decides a lot of these things. Now, because of that, the White House, we already talked about the executive office of the president, the White House has all this staffing, right? So why does the president get the budget passed? Because of the bureaucracy, he or she needs all of this staffing to understand what's happening, right? You need specialists. You need research, analysis, legislative, and legal specialists, right? That's why the president does have personal attorneys. The president has a team of attorneys as part of that office, right? A legal bureau that is just for the executive office, right? And so what they do is they are experts that look at what the bureaucrats are doing, what Congress is doing, what other offices is doing, and explain to the president how those things are working and whether or not they're fitting with the policies and preferences of the executive branch. When you have those things, you also need sort of a communication apparatus, right? The experts don't talk to the agencies, so you need sort of secretaries and undersecretaries to explain to those agencies, right, what the president wants, right, how the president wants things implemented. That specifically look at agencies and make sure they're doing what the expectation is. We talked about the difference between police patrol and fire alarm, right? Congress is not police patrol. They don't go into the agencies and look for problems. What they do is they wait for the agencies or constituents, right, their voters, to say, hey, this agency is doing something wrong, right? And then those committees come in and say, okay, why are my constituents saying something wrong? What are you doing? Should we be changing that behavior, right? And when you have that, you're going to have a little more oversight because it's not about the factual evidence, right? It's not about whether or not they're doing a good job or whether or not they're following their expertise, right? Congressional oversight is saying you might be following your expertise, but that's not what the American people want. And ultimately, the American people decide the behavior of bureaucrats, right? And so this type of fire alarm oversight can really function in a very specific way. One of the reasons why we need a lot of oversight is because I talked about at the beginning of this chapter is legislation is very vague, right? When you pass a law, there are a lot of things that are unclear. There are a lot of details that lack, right? There's an expression, it's a dated expression now, right? But the devil's in the details. And right, one of the things about this expression applies to the fact that when you're trying to get a law passed, the very minute details are the hangups. Right? We all know where we stand, right? As people in general, but also as elected officials, you know where you stand when it comes to certain issues like pro-choice, pro-life, right? When it comes to universal health care, you already know where you stand. But how do we actually do it? How do we cooperate, compromise, moderate that in a way that will actually become law? It's very difficult, and those details are difficult to get to. The other part, right, is that when you have oversight, it can become politicized. And right, the healthcare.gov, significantly long ago that many of you may not remember it, but the argument was that you needed this like website. You needed a website because we're going to have state exchanges. So we needed the websites to allow individuals to go and purchase insurance, right? Health.gov was a website designed specifically so individuals whose states didn't provide their own website could go and they could buy insurance through the new Affordable Care Act, what we call Obamacare. And so the day that website launched, it immediately crashed. And in 24 hours, one person was able to use the website successfully to sign up for the Affordable Care Act's new market of insurances. So when you have something like that, when it's a failure like that, one side is trying to figure out what went wrong, right? Obviously, the Democrats, this is their landmark legislation, this is their big piece, right? The Obama administration, this is their signature bill that they got through, and so its failure is very problematic. But Republicans would use this failure to say, look, the government can't even run a website. Why do you trust them to run insurance, right? So sometimes oversight is very politicized. Benghazi was very politicized, right? There's no criminal evidence. Benghazi was what became an attack on an embassy in which several people died. There was an attack on the embassy in Benghazi. Whether or not something more could have been done is somewhat unclear, right? More could have been done, right? The U.S. military could have come in more force, but also that's a sovereign nation, right? There are some limits to when the military will go into other countries, right? And because of that, there was a lot of arguments that the Secretary of State, at the time, the Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton, that she did such a bad job that she should be prosecuted or she should be punished, right? And so that there should be a punishment. Well, there are limits to what the Secretary of State could do, but this was highly politicized. And I know it sounds biased that I'm saying it, but we had Republicans at the time say that these Benghazi committees, because they had 8 different committees trying to figure out if there was some wrongdoing on the part of the State Department, which failed to save those individuals, right? And obviously some wrongdoing when you have State Department officials dying, but was it criminal? Was it inappropriate? Was it malfeasance or negligence? When you have something like that, a Republican senator once said, we did a very good job at delegitimizing Hillary Clinton, right? That was part of it. That's how we know that part was politicized, right? Because Republicans did a good job of making then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton look like she was not capable and damage her presidential run. That was pre all of this craziness that we have today, but very clearly politicized, right? It wasn't about getting to the truth or oversight over the bureaucracy or over the State Department, but attacking an opponent. And then on the Democrat side, you see the same thing with Elizabeth Warren, right? The TARP money was for the recession money, and Elizabeth Warren sort of came out and she really attacked Republicans. Why is the money not being spent this way? Why is there not enough accountability, right? There was a really strong attack on the other side about the TARP program. And so why it looks biased, right? Both parties do this, right? In fact, we saw, which is not in any of your text yet because it just happened, but in the Coney Barrett, right, in the newest Supreme Court justice, Democrats weren't really asking her about her past, right? We know who she is, right? She is pro-life, right? But she also is a federal judge, right? She believes in stare decisis, which we talked about, right? The idea that precedent matters. And so they would talk about the loss of the Affordable Care Act, not trying to get to more information about her, but definitely trying to politicize her appointment, right? And how politicized that will be is still to be seen because we do not have the benefit of research, right? This just happened and research takes time. Okay. So when we talk about this, I think this is the last slide. Okay, good. So I'm already pretty behind. When we talk about bureaucracy, most Americans believe that bureaucracy is too large. Despite the fact that the federal bureaucracy is shrinking and has shrunk dramatically over the years, there's still a belief that government is too large. And typically when we say government is too large, we mean bureaucracy, right? We mean the bureaucracy is too large. The biggest problem with that is that bureaucracy is already shrinking. It's naturally going to shrink because of technology. So this idea that you have this big bloated bureaucracy, it's not just that people's preferences aren't matching what the government is doing, it's that the perceptions aren't matching what the government is doing, right? That many people believe that bureaucracy is growing and bloated when it's actually shrinking at the federal level. Now, at the state level, that's a different question, right? We know that bureaucracies are going to the state level. Americans also have a very different expectation, right? There was an expression, it's a very dated expression now, right? But $1 worth of services for 40 cents of taxes. Americans hate paying taxes. They pay their taxes because of the IRS, right? Because it has made it very clear that if you don't pay your taxes, you'll go to jail or something bad will happen to you, right? That eventually the IRS will get you if you don't pay your taxes, right? There is a belief that the IRS will come after you, sort of a norm that we have in this country that's not universal. So because of that, right, the argument has always been by Americans for lower taxes, but more services, right? And sometimes we split this along party lines, right? That Republicans and conservatives want less taxes and liberal Democrats want more services. But the reality is you hate paying taxes, right? For those of you that get like a pay stub or whatever, you hate that part of your check that is going to taxes. It's very frustrating to you, right? But you also expect a great deal of services, right? We know that young people think that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. But also we know that young people don't want to pay taxes, right? Those are issues that we have where we have this sort of double thought, to use a George Orwell expression, right? Where we want all these services, but we also don't want to pay for them, right? And so we always have that issue. We talked about privatization and outsourcing, right? There are limits on oversight. So when you privatize or you outsource a job, it's even less oversight because it's no longer a government company, it's no longer a government agency, and that's problematic. And the last part is something I talked about on both days, is you need a balance between bureaucratic autonomy and public scrutiny, right? You need the bureaucrats who are experts to be able to do their job. So they need a little they need it to be a little obscured what they're doing so that they can actually do their job, right? You don't really want everyone to know what the CIA is doing. You also don't really want everyone engaging in how we recycle our water, right? You need expertise deciding those things, right? You need experts deciding those things. But you also don't want a foreign intelligence agency to just run rampant, right? You don't want the CIA to just be going and doing assassinations everywhere. We passed a law. We made it very clear that the US would stop engaging in assassination. I mean, we still engage in drone strikes, but we don't assassinate world leaders, right? So we change that behavior through public scrutiny, right? And we also knew from the past, right, that between Snowden and the Pentagon Papers and WikiLeaks, that sometimes when we find out what the government was doing, we say, you shouldn't have been doing that in the first place. Why were you doing that, right? We wouldn't have let you do that if we knew, right? So there's always a balance between autonomy and public scrutiny. And we want to make sure that we try and find the best balance so that we possibly can. Okay, so that was the end of chapter 14. So you're following along, right, that we're going to open chapter 15, which is the federal courts. Some of these are a little dense. I definitely enjoy some of these aspects, and I know they're a little dry, but let me see if I can sort of catch up. We will have plenty of time. The last class is actually sort of a review of what happened. It's foreign relations, right? It's international and foreign relations is something that will be a shorter topic because it's not really as applicable to you as political scientists unless you specialize in the fields that I specialize in. And then we're going to do in the last class a review of the things that passed, the questions and the initiatives that passed in this election, and sort of discuss what that's going to mean, right? I can sort of do that separately on a video, not in this classroom, so we don't have to add it. So we have a little time, so it's okay that we're behind. But if there's something that you feel I didn't cover as clearly, make sure you come talk to me about that. Okay. So the federal courts, We the People, chapter 15. The federal courts, part of this is that, I apologize. I have to switch back and forth and it doesn't work the way I want it to. So part of the way that the court system works is very codified, right? It's very rigid, right? And intentionally so, right? So the first part is that when you have a case, it should always follow a basic sort of general principle. You should have two sides, right? And then both sides try and show evidence and arguments that they can. And then the judge or the judges, depending on what court you're in, they try and figure out which side has more merit, right? What side has more merit? And merit-based decision-making is very important for the judicial branch, right? It has to be based on the merits, and then we'll talk about precedent in a second. There is a difference between criminal and civil law. Criminal law involves, right, when you have someone who is, if they're punished, if they're found guilty, their punishment will involve incarceration or something worse, right? The death penalty, right? Extradition, right? Whatever it is, right? When you talk about incarceration, or when you talk about actually arresting someone and punishing them with a crime, we mean something different in criminal law. And it's important to have a distinction between criminal law and civil law, and we'll talk about why in a second, right? The standards, what it means to have greater merit, right? In a civil law case and in a Supreme Court case, whatever side has more merit, right, depending on the judges, right, you know that the judges can be conservative or liberal, whatever side has more merit wins. But in a criminal case, right, it has to be so one-sided that there's beyond a reasonable doubt. And we'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to use the terms plaintiff and defendant, right? A plaintiff is just the one who brings the complaint, right? That should be very easy, the terms share, right? The complaint, the person who brings the complaint is the plaintiff, and the person who tries to defend themselves is the defendant. So I don't think that language is difficult. So you have laws, they're based on cases, and they're based on precedent. And precedent just means what cases have been decided in the past, right? What have past cases said? And when you're looking at the current case, you decide the current case on past cases, right? Why is it that many cases don't go to the Supreme Court when it comes to pro-choice or pro-life? Because Roe v. Wade made it very clear that abortion was a privacy right? It was a constitutional privacy right. And so there have been a lot of court cases that went to the Supreme Court in the past, but because those cases have said there's a right to privacy, and therefore it's not something we can legislate because that's something that happens in their privacy, or they have a right to privacy when they're engaging in that, that precedent holds, right? It is not a moral argument, it's not a preference argument, it's a precedent argument. The cases before it were cited. Why are none of the bans in government, right? Why are no state bans on same-sex marriage upheld? Because the court passed a case, and that past case decides future cases, right? We talked about Brown versus the Board of Education and segregation, right? Brown versus the Board of Education is why you can't split groups up by race or ethnicity, right? That's inappropriate based on that case. Precedent also ties into this concept, and you heard it when the last Supreme Court Justice, Justice Coney Barrett, was in the hearings, and she says, I believe in stare decisis, right? And this is a positive thing, but we kind of knew that the judge was going to say this. You can't get to a federal level judge position, or high level federal judge position, unless you believe in stare decisis. And stare decisis is a doctrine. So precedent is the previous cases. Stare decisis is the doctrine that a previous decision applies in similar cases until that decision is overruled, right? So stare decisis is the thought, the concept, the belief that precedent matters, right? Precedent is just that we care about things that happened before, right? Precedent means past cases influence the next case or the present case, right? Stare decisis is why precedent matters. The other part about a case is what we call rule of law. And rule of law is very important. And in the American system, we have had some recent challenges, but we have very high rule of law. And what that means is that every single person is judged the same, right? And there are no exceptions. We're actually going to see a big test to this in the transition, right? That very few arguments are left that there won't be a transition. So when Biden becomes president on January 20th, right? If there are no sort of major huge revelations, right? Biden will become president in January, and the president will no longer be, right? President Donald Trump will be the former president, right? He will be a private citizen again. And the Southern District of New York said, once he's no longer president, we're gonna prosecute him, right? We believe he evaded taxes. We believe that he engaged in some inappropriate behavior with women, right? That there may be criminal and civil lawsuits coming from that district. That is because no individual is sort of protected. The only reason why we might see rule of law not apply is because of the pardon. And we've talked about the pardon, right? That it is unclear whether or not Trump can pardon himself, but because we have a long-standing tradition of not punishing former presidents, it is possible that Biden's team will say, we're not going to pursue prosecution on the former president, right? It might be possible that Biden might push for moving past this. And we've seen that language a lot, right? So sometimes, even though rule of law applies to everyone the same, sometimes there's a belief that we need to keep moving, right? And so we might see a test in rule of law coming in the next couple of weeks, right? We also see a lot of court cases, right? So the election is not certified yet. right? I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying it is when it's not. It's not. Okay, so there are different types of courts, right? We've actually talked about this when we talked about Nevada. The first is a trial court. A trial court is just the first court you go for a case, right? You go in, and when we're talking about a trial court, this is where you actually present your evidence, right? All the other courts don't really deal in the evidence. They deal in whether or not there was validity and everything that happened, right? Often when you take a criminal case to appeals, it's not, oh, I was actually innocent. It was the way they collected evidence violated my Fourth Amendment, or the way that I'm being treated violated my Fifth Amendment. I was forced to give a statement and I incriminated myself. So I violated my Fifth Amendment, and that was forced, right? Court of Appeals deal with whether or not something is an error. Only the trial court deals with whether or not there's guilt or innocence, or whether a civil case should favor one, the plaintiff or the defendant. So we started the trial court. After a trial court, if one side believes that it didn't occur in the way that they believe it to occur, right? This happens more in civil cases than criminal cases, because a district attorney will prosecute, and if there's a not guilty, they sort of just, that's the finality, right? Not guilty is final. But if you're found guilty in a criminal case, then often the person who is found guilty, the defendant, right, can appeal that process to see if there is something that was a legal error, right? So this is part of that when we're trying to determine legal error, were your constitutional rights violated? So because of that, right, we're not looking at introducing new witnesses. We're not trying to determine guilt or innocence. We're just trying to find out if it was handled appropriately. And that, because of that reason, there's no new evidence, there's no witnesses, right? It is just the evidence that was already introduced in the trial court and whether or not that's valid evidence. Because we have such a large criminal justice system, and because I talked about, right, that a murder charge, if you're a district attorney and you want to prosecute someone for murder, that could cost the district $1 million. So because of that, regardless of the violence of the crime, regardless of the horrific nature of the crime, you might still offer a plea bargain because it's cost effective, or because, right, that you just don't feel that all of the evidence is there. Sometimes when there's a plea bargain, it's that the prosecutor is like, well, this is going to be a tough case, so I'll offer you a plea bargain, and then we don't have to go through this tough case, and I can get a win rather than try and leave it up to a jury. And so a plea bargain is just negotiation, right? And this is only in criminal cases. There are no plea bargains in civil cases because no one goes to jail. Typically, no one goes to jail. A civil case that becomes criminal goes into criminal court. So this is criminal courts, and the defendant makes an agreement to plead guilty, and in exchange, right, they get a reduced prison sentence, or they get some sort of reduction in how severe the process is. Now, there are huge advantages to this. You need plea bargains, right? Because a high percentage of cases go to plea bargain. It lowers the court's burden. If there was no plea bargain, the courts could not fulfill a speedy trial, right? You have a constitutional right to a speedy trial, to not just be held indefinitely in prison, right? Or in jail until they figure out what's happening. You have a right to a speedy trial. So one of the advantages is it takes the burden off the court, and so those individuals don't have to be in the system for long periods of time. It also saves, as I talked about, the prosecution of a lot of resources. If you can get someone to plead guilty, you don't have to spend all that money getting researchers and collecting evidence and really going through that process. Now, obviously, you can hear the disadvantages, right? If you're not really going through to be absolutely sure that this person is guilty, right, then a couple of things can happen. You can coerce an innocent person to pleading guilty, right? And this is very problematic, right? Because once they plead guilty, the court is rule-based. So it doesn't matter if when it comes back, they pled guilty. So the court treats it that they admitted to their guilt, right? So coercion is very problematic. The other part is that Black and Hispanic individuals are less likely to have high levels of defense, right? A public defender usually doesn't have a lot of time in a case. And so what you see is plea bargains are more likely with poor minorities, right? People of color are more have more opportunities to take a plea bargain because they don't have the resources to defend themselves, right? Sometimes it's very clear that even if you are innocent, it's going to cost you $100,000 for a case that would actually possibly find you not guilty. And when you're in that situation, a plea bargain might be a way, even though you're innocent, to save yourself from something worse, and then continue through the appeals to say that you're innocent, right? We also see this because even though our population is still, is transitioning, but it is still majority white, prisons are majority minority, right? The majority of prisoners are Black, or people of color, Black, Hispanic. And we know from data that white males are more likely to be, I don't think it's a majority. They're overrepresented, it's not a majority, because it would have to be a way over majority, right? So I take that back. But they are represented, they're not necessarily majority, because right, only 8 to 12% of the population is Black, only about 30 to 30%. It would have to be a huge overrepresentation for them to be the majority in prisons. But they are overrepresented. And because of that, because we know, we have a lot of evidence that white males are typically more violent, statistically white males are more violent than other groups, right? That for the overrepresentation to be in minorities, there's a problem with this system, right? The people, because they're poor, because they can't mount a good defense, right? It makes it more likely that there's a racial component who gets a plea bargain and possibly innocent individuals going in. So you have a criminal system, you have a civil system. You also need to figure out which court places are going to, right? Sometimes we talk about this as jurisdiction, right? Jurisdiction is their power and their authority. And we mean this two ways. Jurisdiction can mean the territory, right? We're in the 9th district, right? Where you live is jurisdiction, right? You would not, I'm from California, you're not going to get arrested. If you do something wrong, you're not going to interact with California police, you're going to interact with Nevada police, right? That's jurisdiction. The other part is this idea of original jurisdiction and what cases go directly to those courts, right? So while you would go to a local court, while you would go to a state court, there are some cases where federal courts are the original jurisdiction. This means that instead of going to a state court or a local court or a criminal court, some cases go right to the federal courts, right? The federal district courts, right? The circuit courts. And there are a couple of cases. The first is if it's between between the U.S. and one of the states, right? If Nevada sues the federal government, it has to go to a federal court, obviously, right? Or if a federal court sues Nevada, right? Then it has to go immediately to a federal court. If it's between two states, right, it's a federal issue. So if Nevada sues California or Arizona sues Nevada, right? Now, states can sue each other based on discrimination, right? And this has happened quite a bit, right? There have been a lot of states where they make an argument that their citizens of their states are being discriminated against, right? You actually pay, if you're an out-of-state student, you pay out-of-state tuition. You pay more in tuition than you normally would if you were in-state, right? It seems like discrimination. So there have been a lot of cases about the difference between out-of-state and in-state, right? But that we talked about funding, right? If you're in-state, you're part of this tax base, you're funded it. But between two states, goes to a federal court. When you have a foreign ambassador or minister, right? Diplomatic immunity is sort of the stretched out thing in movies. Very few people have any version of diplomatic immunity. And often it's only for misdemeanors, right? There are limits to what diplomatic immunity can do. So when you have an ambassador who does something illegal, right, like a DUI, they still go to court. Ambassadors don't get diplomatic immunity for DUIs. They get diplomatic immunity for like parking tickets and other factors, right? So when you have something like that, you need the federal government involved because the foreign aspect of it means it has to deal with the federal level rather than the state level. And then on some cases, one state will go after a citizen of another state, right? If you have a business and you are a resident of Nevada, but your business takes you into California, and for some reason, let's say that your vehicles are violating pollution or smog checks in California, California could sue you, but then it would have to go to a federal court because you're a citizen of Nevada, right? So notice when I'm talking about the original jurisdiction, it's usually when states are involved and then it's usually across state lines, right? Federal involvement often is when state lines are crossed in the cases. I already talked about this. Nevada is in the Ninth Circuit Court. It's the West Coast. It's one of the largest circuit courts, right? So it's very busy because it has such a large population.
Yeah, but what does it say on against citizen of another state? It's not like completely blocking out the text.
Cases from one state against a citizen of another state.
Yeah, what's the state on this?
Oh, just the federal appellate court circuits, right? But there are a number of appellate court circuits. The Ninth Circuit Court is the one that Nevada is in, right? And these are just geographically, right? That each section of the country has its own circuit court, just because, right, we want to break up the population so that the courts can handle fairly equivalent loads, right? Except the Ninth Circuit Court is always very busy because it has California, Nevada, right? It has the West Coast, and you have dramatically different laws on the West Coast, right? The variation in law on the West Coast is very problematic, and West Coast states have more fights with the government, right? That you have a lot of fights between the government. California is like the 12th largest economy in the world, right? If you took California and treated it as an independent nation, it would still be the 12th largest economy in the world. And when you have that much difference in West Coast values and you have that much economic power, you're going to have a fight between the state and the government, right? The same thing is true of New York State, right? New York State often combats with the government because they have a lot of authority and power, right? Whereas when you have like a landlocked state in the center of the country, they don't have really the power or the difference in values to fight with, right? So the circuit courts, some circuit courts are very busy. The Ninth Circuit Court is often very busy. And also, right, the West Coast, even though Colorado adopted legalization first, the West Coast was really the break-off point when you had a lot of states passing legalization early on. And there are a lot of fights about whether or not the federal government should be sort of criminalizing all of that behavior, or if there's a state right, which is part of your paper, which you'll see, right, that this is a big legal question. So when you're looking at the law, there are a couple of things that you have a right to, right? And we talked about your constitutional rights, but also there's a certain aspects of the law that apply to everyone that aren't really spelled out in the Constitution but still exist, right? Due process of law means that you are protected against arbitrary action by the government, right? Whether it's national or state. And what does it mean, arbitrary? If you are doing something the government doesn't want you to do, but you're not breaking a law, then you can't be prosecuted, right? You can't be prosecuted. Why do we have specific sort of documents and permits for protests? Because there has to be a right for civil speech, but also the government has to say, did you have a permit for this protest? What streets are you allowed to be on, right? By codifying the law, due process can function much better. And it protects us against arbitrary action, right? An officer cannot decide that you broke the law because you're doing something they don't like. There has to be a pre-existing law that you are breaking, right? That's due process of law. The other part is this idea of a writ of habeas corpus. Whenever an individual is detained or arrested, they have to, and this is guaranteed by the Constitution, that they have to be brought into court and show why, right? What this means today is that if a police officer stops you, that police officer is required through this writ of habeas corpus to say why they stopped you. One of the reasons why officers say, do you know why I stopped you? In part is because they want you to say that you did something wrong, and then it speeds the whole process up, the interaction up, but also because they have to explain to you why you were stopped, right? Whenever you're detained, this idea of habeas corpus, right, which means to hold the body, right? Whenever you have an interaction with law enforcement, there has to be an explanation. Now, this has not always been true, right? Obviously, we have some issues, right? The practice, the de facto practice is often different than the de jure law, right? One of the things is that we know in the past that during the Civil War that there has a legal argument that if there's a rebellion or an invasion, that habeas corpus can be suspended, right? Lincoln very famously decided that during the Civil War, the individuals could be held, right? He suspended habeas corpus. And he said individuals can be held indefinitely without being told why they're being held, right? If we're in a civil war, maybe that holds true. But by doing that, what he did is he opened this idea of precedent, right? We talked about previous cases and precedent, right? When the president does something, it creates precedent in and of itself because that individual is the president. And because of that, now we often argue if this is a case where they should be treated as a citizen with citizens' rights, or if we can use this where we don't have to provide habeas corpus. However, individuals in the United States are all protected by this writ of habeas corpus. And that means you have to be told why you're being detained. People who aren't citizens, right, they can detain you because you're not a citizen. That in and of itself, right, if you don't have the proper documentation is a crime. So they have a loop. It's not a loophole, right? They're telling you why you're detained because you don't have the proper documentation, right? Not a legal question, but right, if you were driving without a license and you were stopped, they would say you don't have a license. That's why we stopped you. I don't know how they would find out, but right, the point is that that's right. If you don't have the documentation to say you could be in the United States, then they don't need a habeas corpus because they can say the reason why you're being held is the lack of documentation, right? Why they stopped you in the first place is problematic in and of itself, right? But right, writ of habeas corpus says you have to be told why you're being detained. All right, so there are federal trial courts. And one of the things that is unique about a federal trial courts, which we do see in some states, right? The Breonna Taylor case had a grand jury. New York requires a grand jury. Those are unique in the states. In federal courts, there's always has to be a grand jury. The way a grand jury works is it's just the jurors, and it's not the same jurors from the trial. So you take 12 peers, right? You take 12 jurors, right? People who are in your peer group. And then an attorney for the state, a federal attorney, right? They explain to these 12 people the argument that they're given for the case. That's the way a grand jury works. And so it's just the prosecutor and the jury. At this time, this is the prosecutor and the jury. The prosecutor has to convince the jury, right? Has to convince the jury that there is enough evidence that can go to trial, right? A grand jury does not decide guilt. What a grand jury is trying to decide is, should we arrest or indict these individuals? Is there enough evidence, right? And so the federal government is always required to do this first. Before they arrest someone, they have to go through a grand jury, right? Unless it's something violent or sort of stopping a violent behavior, right? When they're actively stopping about, they can arrest and then prosecute later. But when they're trying to see if someone broke the law, they have to go to a grand jury and convince, right, a grand jury that that individual, that state, whatever it is, has broken the law and there's enough evidence to go to a court case. This is not beyond a reasonable doubt. This is more preponderance of evidence, right? Is there enough evidence to go to court? Then you have to go to a trial jury, and then this is universal, right? In a criminal trial, it's supposed to be a group of your peers, right? So we will talk about whether or not that's the case, right? If you have a black male and an all-white jury, is that really a group of your peers, right? There's always that case. But because the United States was founded on this idea of not having arbitrary action, of not having a king or a monarch tell you when you're guilty, of having rule of law that applies to everyone, it has to be a unanimous jury verdict, right? Every single one of those 12 people. And when you have a grand jury, those 12 people are different, right? So you have a grand jury and then everyone goes away. And then just the prosecutor comes back with a new jury and it's a trial. And there have to be, beyond a reasonable doubt, show that this person is guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, whatever reasonable doubt is very complicated, right? But it's not no doubt, right? There can be some doubts in your mind, but there can't be any reasonable doubts. And we'll talk about that as we move through this chapter. In the federal system, about 20% of all our cases are reviewed. So you go from a trial court to an appeal court. And this could be the circuit court. This could be just another appeals court, depending on the type of case. Is it civil? Is it criminal? Does it involve a state? Is it just two individuals? Whatever it is, what federal law was broken? And so when you go to the federal appellate courts, these cases take multiple judges. And those judges are looking at it from not necessarily a liberal and a conservative perspective, but is there anything in the cases that shows a violation of the way the the trial should have occurred, right? Now remember, this is not about guilt or innocence in an appellate court. It's not guilt or innocence in an appellate court. What we are trying in an appellate court to say is was there any evidence corrected inappropriately? Did they violate the Fourth Amendment of legal search and seizure? Was the individual coerced into saying something that was not actually true or they don't believe to be true? That's a violation of your Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. Did that coercion involve what we would call cruel and unusual punishment, right? Now, the thing is courts have decided that law enforcement officers can lie to people who are detained. They can lie to you, right? They have to tell you a real reason. They have to tell you a real reason why you're being detained. But once they have given you a real reason for your detention, when they're discussing the reasons why they believe you committed that crime, a law enforcement officer can lie to you. So where is it that there is a lie, right? That you're allowed to lie to sort of get people's information. And where does that lie cross the line of coercion, right? And sometimes we talk about this. If you tell a person who you believe is guilty, right? Law enforcement is talking to someone who's been arrested for a crime, and you explain to them the horrors of going into jail, or the horror of being in prison, right? And how horrific that's going to be, is that coercion? Do you just scare them into confessing something that's not true, right? What is the line for coercion? And we know that the Eighth Amendment provides against cruel and unusual punishment. So if it's cruel to tell them all these horrible things, does that violate it? Does that violate the case? And those are just the constitutional aspects, right? Like all of the thousands of cases that have come before the case that we would be discussing, right? This hypothetical case, all of those cases also inform how trials have to occur. So if any precedent, anything that was given by stare decisis, right, of the previous cases, the precedent that exists, if any of that is violated, then the appellate court will say, okay, this evidence doesn't fit, or you can't use this evidence and we need to retrial, right? Sometimes that will occur, say, this evidence should not have been applied, and because it was applied, we need to go back and do a retrial, right? And what they do is they say this, when that individual was found guilty, it's no longer going to hold. But the DA can prosecute again because they weren't found not guilty. Now, all of this happens, and then you have the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is actually the only court it is the only court in the federal system that's actually created by the Constitution, right? The original version of the Supreme Court was only supposed to deal with issues that come from the government, right? Whether or not states disagree, right? These are supposed to be issues between the governments and the states, right? This was never really about some of the other things that the Supreme Court issued, right? The argument that comes before the Supreme Court and the federal courts is because of the complexity of the system, right? You need all these circuit courts. The Supreme Court also has a Chief Justice, and we're going to talk a second about how they get to a case. But a couple of things about the Supreme Court. They do not have to take up any case. They're independent, right? Remember, we have branches of government. The judicial branch is separate. It is a separate branch, right? And because it's a separate branch, the president can't force, the executive branch can't force them to take up a case. Congress can't tell them to take up a case. They have a specific standard that they choose to follow, right? And they are their own oversight, right? What public opinion does not apply to the Supreme Court. In fact, public opinion is higher on the Supreme Court than Congress, but Congress has to respond to public opinion and the Supreme Court doesn't, right? We, as Americans, we think highly of the Supreme Court. We did in the past, and we don't trust Congress. But the Supreme Court has no requirement to actually respond to the public, right? It doesn't care what the public wants because it's not preference driven, it's case driven, right? I actually wrote this a while ago, so it's surprising that John Roberts is still the current Chief Justice. There is no specification, right? We talked about this in Nevada, I'm gonna talk about this in the federal system. There's no specification of how many judges there should be. It has been tradition that there be 9 judges in the Supreme Court. During the Great Depression, FDR threatened the court, what's called court packing, is say, I'm just going to add judges till I get a liberal majority, right? That was a Democratic majority for FDR, right? And so there always has been a concern about court packing, right? There have been 9 justices since 1869. We know there's always going to be an odd number of justices. You need an odd number Because if you have an even number, you can get split decisions, and that does nothing, right? You need an odd number of justices. But you could have 15 justices, right? Technically, right, we have a 6-3 majority, right? There's 6 conservatives and 3 liberals in the Supreme Court right now. If you wanted, you could just add 4, you could go from 9 to 13, right? The Biden administration, I don't think this is what will happen, but the Biden administration could just take 4 people and make 4 Democratic nominations, because the Constitution doesn't say how many justices are supposed to be in the Supreme Court. So court packing is always a thing that can happen. Now, we're going to have a Republican Senate, so it'll probably be a very different behavior, right? But we do see, right, that court packing is something that can be politically done, right? And there are too many Republican senators to really expect that to happen under the Biden, because the Senate confirms a Supreme Court justice, not the president. The president nominates the Senate. The president and the executive branch nominate. Congress, specifically the Senate, right, ratify and approve an individual, and then once they become in the Supreme Court, they are independent from either branch. So we've actually seen a lot of these. In the last 4 years, we've seen 3, which is actually a lot more than we would expect, right? During the entire Obama administration, I think there were only 2 chief appointments to the Supreme Court, right? There might have been 3, right? We can always talk about 2016 when the Senate forced a new president, forced it to where there wasn't a Senate confirmation hearing, and sort of allowed the new president, what became President Trump, to pick up a Supreme Court justice at the beginning of his term, and then also whether or not delaying or pushing through Supreme Court Justice Coney Barrett, right? That added more, but essentially, right, there have been 3 shifts, right? And what happens is whenever someone can't do their job, sometimes you have Supreme Court justices retire. Because of modern healthcare, it seems like the trend is going to continue to be that justices will die in office, right? They will die in office, which is part of a problem because it creates a lot of unpredictability, right? When Scalia died, there was no expectation that Scalia would die. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, it came at a time where there's so many other things going on in our life. It was sort of just shocking that occurred. Now, they were both very old. It's not that shocking. They both died of natural causes, or the expectations that they both died of natural causes. No conspiracy theories, right? I don't actually know how they died. But there's no conspiracy, right? They were old people. Old people can die. That's part of life, right? But because of that, there's a lot of unpredictability. And so then you need to start picking up someone else, right? So the first part is when you have a vacancy, right? Even though we don't have any specific rules, right? We limit it to 9. So when you have a vacancy, the first part is what we call senatorial courtesy. And this is not a law, this is just a behavior where when someone wants to nominate, when the executive branch wants to nominate a new Supreme Court justice, they go to that person's state and they talk to the senators of that state and say, okay, should we not push this person through? Now, senatorial courtesy works for 2 different reasons. One is, does that senator know something, right? Does that senator know something about that individual to say, oh, you shouldn't push this person through, right? There was some expectation when Kavanaugh was pushed through that there would be some problems about his past, right? There were some current concerns that there would be claims about his drinking or his behavior in the past, right? So the senators were like, there's not enough there, right? There's not enough there to really push through. And the other thing is that when you talk to the senators, do they want that person to go through, right? There is some influence by those senators to say, I don't want this person to become a Supreme Court justice, right? That should not happen, right? So senatorial courtesy is a behavior among the Senate and the executive branch to sort of agree on an individual. There are no formal qualifications for service as a federal judge, right? But to be a circuit judge or Supreme Court justice, usually you have to have such a prestigious career that we don't have to worry about qualifications. It's highly unlikely. I know that Kennedy appointed, right, that when Kennedy became a justice, maybe not as many qualifications, but also his public service record was there, right? And he was clearly served in a qualified position, right? I don't think there are any questions about any Supreme Court justice being qualified, right? That's not really, like we talk about it, but that's not really a question. They're all qualified. And then after they're nominated by the president, they're confirmed by the Senate, right? So you need the Senate and the executive branch, the president and the Senate, to work together to get a Supreme Court justice. That's why Obama couldn't get his nominee through in 2016, right? But despite sort of pushback in the House, why the Senate and the president a few months ago, or less than a few months ago, right, were able to push through Justice Coney Barrett. Okay. So what gives the court the right? We actually talked about this idea of Marbury versus Madison, and this idea of judicial review. So initially, the Supreme Court was just a courthouse, right? It was just the first courthouse, right? The first federal courthouse. So there's a historical example. I don't want to say it's Johnson. I don't want to get this wrong. Originally, the Supreme Court is set up, and the first Chief Justice resigns fairly quickly after it's created. And his argument is that it doesn't do anything. It's a courthouse, yes, it's a courthouse, but it doesn't actually do anything involving government. And so from sort of 77, right after the War of Independence, right, going into the end of the 18th century in the 1790s, the Supreme Court doesn't have a lot of power, right? It really is just a courthouse, right? It decides civil cases, it decides questions of the law. And that would always be the case until Marbury versus Madison. And Marbury versus Madison provides what is called judicial review. And what is so important about judicial review is it can declare a law unconstitutional, right? This is Obergefell v. Hodges, this is Loving v. Virginia, this is Roe v. Wade, right? All of those cases, right? This is Brown versus the Board of Education. Every single one of those cases is a case in which the Supreme Court says wherever this law exists in the United States, it cannot be enforced, right? We just had a question, right, on our election about taking away that language of bans on same-sex marriage, right? But unless the court has some huge reversal, right, one of the things is that was just a symbolic change, right? Yes, the state of Nevada is going to remove language, and they have to vote on it twice because it's an amendment to the Constitution, but they are going to remove language about bans on same-sex marriage. But bans on same-sex marriage were not going to be acceptable because of judicial review, right? Judicial review, starting with Marbury Madison, gives the court this really strong power to declare the constitutionality of a law. And because of that, you get a huge split in what people think the Supreme Court should do, right? Justice Coney Barrett, Dave Clerk for Justice Scalia, they're both constitutional, right, originalists, right? They do not interpret the Constitution to apply to a modern context. They say, what did the framers of the Constitution exactly mean when they wrote this document? I'm not going to interpret this document into modern times. I'm going to treat it word for word. What does the document say? And that's how I'm going to decide if something's constitutional, right? Very different behaviors, right? We know in the 60s and 70s, the Warren courts were more what we call liberal activism or judicial activism, where they said, I'm going to interpret it into this modern context. Why does it matter so much, right? We talked about this as well, but there's a supremacy clause. In Article 6 of the Constitution, it makes it very clear. If there's a national law and if there's something in the national government and there is something in this one of the states, the national government wins, right? That's what the supremacy clause says. If there's a difference between those things, the national government wins. Why am I having a red paper marijuana legalization? One, it's a boring topic. It's dated, right? It is a dated topic, right? We've already sort of, as a country, we've already decided that legalization is going to happen in most places, right? It's winning all over the country. So our policies and our preferences are already on legalization, right? So why talk about that specific issue? Because of the supremacy clause. The court systems is going to look at the supremacy clause and says, is this a federal issue? And therefore, the federal government's ban on marijuana use is going to be what's applied, or is this a states' rights issue? And what really this is about constitutionality. Does the Article 6 matter more, or does the 10th Amendment matter more, right? And there's no like what order or chronology that really, these are difficult questions that require judicial review. So when we come in judicial review, the first part is that after 1932 and the New Deal starts, you have all of these federal agencies. And these federal agencies have really broad mandates, right? Part of the New Deal era, right, the era that we're still in, right, the last 100 years, right, is that the government now has a mandate to take care of you, right? If you are starving or unemployed, right, or whatever condition that you're in, there are some benefits that are expected to be provided to citizens of the United States. But that means we have to know about where you're at, right? How much money do you have? If you say, I need services, you have to say, okay, is this person a citizen? Does this person have limited resources? Do they really need this service, right? And when you need all of those things, it creates a huge problem because I might have to violate your rights to help you, right? Those two things become very difficult, right? We talked about this difference between liberty and equality. Liberty means leaving you alone. Equality of opportunity means giving everyone sort of the same jumping off point. You can't have both of those, right? I can't leave everyone alone and there be equality. And the more equality we provide, right, the more likely we are to violate someone's personal liberties, right? So these are problems that come in. And so judicial review really is necessary because we're trying to balance all of these mandates that are given and whether or not the mandates themselves violate the Constitution or whether their application does, right? And we always want to work on that. In 2004, this individual named Hamdi, he was a U.S. citizen. He had gone to work for a foreign, I want to say he went to, this is before ISIS. So I want to say Afghanistan is where he picked up. And so Rumsfeld at the time is the Secretary of Defense. This is during the George W. Bush administration. And so what happens is the security apparatus and the military apparatus, they arrest someone or they detain someone, right? This is not, at the time when they're detaining him, they don't know he's a U.S. citizen. So they pull this person in, and because he's not a U.S. citizen, there's no prosecution of the law, right? They just hold that person. It's a prisoner of war or an enemy combatant, and so their rights aren't the same. You don't have the same rights as an enemy combatant that you do as a U.S. citizen. And so Hamdi is taken, and he starts going through interrogation, and it becomes clear that he is a U.S. citizen. He is a U.S. citizen. He has a U.S. citizenship. And so then becomes the argument between Hamdi, the individual, who is suing the federal government to say, I have rights under the U.S. citizen. I'm a citizen, therefore the Bill of Rights, all of those things apply to me. I have a right, the 8th Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. I have the 5th Amendment about self-incrimination. You can't force me to say what I did, and you can't hold me indefinitely. Right? I have a right to a speedy trial. I have a writ of habeas corpus. You have to say what I did, and you have to prosecute that. And so Rumsfeld argued that when you are not in the U.S., right, when you're actively working against U.S. interests, you're no longer a U.S. citizen, right? That person forfeited their citizenship rights by going through that. The problem is, eventually the Hamdi case becomes that he is a U.S. citizen, he's going to be prosecuted. But then he's prosecuted, I don't think the federal government, he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison, right? That he is eventually prosecuted for his crimes, but the court decides, no, he is a citizen. And we actually have a legal process. You can denounce your citizenship to the United States. That's something that you can do. But in that process, it's a legal process. You have to go through that process, right? Because he hadn't done that, he was still a citizen. That's a court deciding based on precedent, not on the morality of it, not on the necessity of it, but on the precedent of it. And so presidential power really runs this a lot. What can the president do? And what can the president do as commander in chief? And what limits are there in the court? And judicial review happens then. The other part is this idea of common law. So whenever you decide a case, one of the things that happens is that case might create law, right? So Obergefell v. Hodges is a case, right? This is a case that came before the United States Supreme Court, and they decided that because of the way the Constitution is written about discrimination based on sex or based on preference, orientation, right? That there's enough in the Constitution to say that the government is not allowed to discriminate based on the sex of the people getting into a marriage, right? One of two things, right? The federal government doesn't actually create any marriage certificates. Everyone is married in a state, right? That's the first part. The second part is if you have bans on same-sex marriage, right, I am passing essentially a law that says all bans are unconstitutional, right? Over Beverly Hodges doesn't just say, right, these two people are allowed to get married. Because it says this marriage license has to be upheld because you can't discriminate based on the fact if they're opposite sex or same-sex partners, then all of a sudden the law has to change. And this becomes common law. And common law is all the laws that are made through precedent, right? Here's a decision on a court case, and laws have to change. Because two things have to happen. First, any bans on same-sex marriage have to end, right? You can't continue to ban on same-sex marriage. But as we saw, right, there was an individual, and this is quite a few years ago, if a court clerk or a county clerk or someone working in the government refuses to provide those things to those people, right, then there can be prosecution of obstruction on that individual. And there was an individual, it was a very minor story where a county clerk was refusing to provide same-sex marriage licenses, right, as an individual. And that individual was arrested because there was obstruction. They refused to do it. They were told you can't keep doing that, right? And then eventually there was a criminal prosecution for that continued obstruction. That's so long ago, and there have been so many awful things that have happened in the last few years that we forget about that, but that is common law, right? Not just that you can't have the bans, but if anyone tries to keep the bans in place, then a new law is created to say you're violating this, and that's common law. The other part is tort cases. This is much more common in civil, right? This is only in civil, right? This is compensation. This has less statute, right? There aren't as many laws about do you owe me money because of what you did. And it's very difficult to quantify how much is owed. So if you're a company and you dump into the water supply, right? Whatever your company is, right? Let's say you make something that requires mercury. And then you have this excess mercury, but it's contaminated, and so you can't use it. And so you dump it into the ground, right? What else are you going to do with it, right? There's very limited ways that you can get rid of mercury, right? And it's very expensive to process, right? So you just dump it in the water supply in the ground. And your argument is there's so much water and so much ground that, yeah, it'll be in the ground, but it won't change the levels to be harmful. And so then an individual says, no, my children are having all these health issues because of that. Well, how do I quantify, right? How do I quantify the value of that? And that was why statute doesn't, I don't know what happened. It just doesn't work anymore. These things aren't going down. It's very frustrating. For those of you not in the classroom, right, the blinds don't work anymore, so there's sunlight coming in at weird angles. And I'll talk to them tomorrow, but there's no way to do about it today. When you're in a tort case, you're saying previous cases have said that this type of damage is worth 1.2 million. And then if the decision in that case is, well, this one's a little different, right? If mercury in the water supply causes brain damage to these children, it used to be 1.2 million per child, but this is mercury poisoning, and it doesn't just cause cognitive abilities, it causes social abilities. So whenever there's a social ability, right, whenever it causes social cognition and learning to be both damaged, it's not worth 1.2 million, it's worth 1.6 million per individual impacted, right? So tort law is all about cases and the precedents and calculating, because the statute can't really quantify all of these aspects. Sorry, I'm just checking. I do want to get through this today, but I don't want to, yeah, there's no way. When we're talking about common law, we have some very clear examples. These are things that I want you to know. And the problem with this is you do need to know the names, right? I do need to know the names. But some of these are so historically important that it's okay, I think, to talk about them. So in 1948, we talked about restrictive covenants. A restrictive covenant is where you buy a house and I'm selling you the house and I say, you can't ever sell this to a minority. That's a restrictive covenant, right? I can say, I'll sell you my house, but I want this covenant in the purchase to say you can never sell it to a black person, right? Very, very problematic. Clearly violates the 14th Amendment, right? And so in 1948, a common law, a precedent is designed that that's not enforceable. We know Brown versus Board of Education. right? Plessy versus Ferguson is the case that starts segregation, right? That starts legal segregation. Well, it starts segregation to be legal through the Supreme Court, right? In Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court says segregation is fine because things can be separate and equal, right? In 54, Brown versus Board of Education, I don't expect you to know the years, they're just listed in chronological order. But in Brown versus the Board of Education, the argument here is no, if it's separate, it's inherently unequal. You can't have two things that are separate, right? There's no way that the classroom teaching that I'm doing matches the online teaching, right? They're dramatically different, right? They cannot be equal because they are separated, right? So because of that, you cannot have, right? You cannot have segregation. It can't be equal. There's no way for it to be equal, right? That's very important. Engel versus Vitale is about school prayer. So you had a school that was one religion, and I want to say Vitale, but I don't expect you to know who is who, right? Just what the cases mean, right? And so you have a school that is one religion and a student that is separate religion. Both of these are religious individuals, but they're different sects of Christianity, I believe. And so the school is leading prayer, and the individual is saying, I can't participate in that prayer because I have different beliefs, right? Whatever the two different types of Christianity they are, they can engage, right? And so it eventually goes all to the way to the Supreme Court, and what they decide is individuals can pray in school, but schools cannot lead prayer. So it's not until 1962 that you really see this distinction between prayer in school and prayer led by the school. So you stop seeing prayer led by the school. Now you still see in sports like coaches like leading their athletes in prayer. There's some of that, right? There's some sort of leeway because that's a voluntary. No one has to play on the sports team, right? There's some of those issues are there. But also around the same time in the 50s and 60s, right? Conservatives add one nation under God, right? The under God part to the Pledge of Allegiance, right? So you still have this mixed bag of can you have religion? What does it mean to have religion, right? How much religion can be in schools, right? Engel v. Vitale really starts to get in that aspect. Gideon versus Wainwright changes our entire legal system, right? You have to be provided legal counsel. When I say if you can't afford an attorney, one will provide for you, this is Gideon versus Wainwright. Some people do not have, and in fact, most people don't have the ability to defend themselves. They don't understand the courts well enough to defend themselves. And because they don't understand the courts well enough to defend themselves, there can't be a fair trial. You can't have a fair trial if one of the individuals understands. I have 5 degrees now. I have a master's, a bachelor's, and I think 3 associates. I would be at a loss in a court system. I wouldn't know what to do, right? I'm educated in political science. I would still not know how to run a court system. You need very specialized information, right? This is a bureaucracy as well, right? So very specialized information. So if it's so difficult to understand the system, the legal counsel has to be provided. And that's what Gideon versus Wainwright decided. In Escobedo versus Illinois, you have this reinforced that you have a right to remain silent, have counsel present. The Fifth Amendment says you have a right against self-incrimination. What it doesn't say is that you can remain silent. It just says that you don't have to confess to crimes. You don't have to incriminate yourself. But you can be forced to talk until Escobedo versus Illinois, right? And this also reinforces that the court has to provide you legal counsel, but if you say you want counsel present, right, the police officers have to stop talking to you, right? And this all leads up to Miranda versus Arizona. And this becomes what are called the Miranda rights. And most of you are probably familiar with the Miranda rights, right? You have a right to remain silent, right? You have a right to an attorney. You have a right, if you can't afford an attorney, won't provide for you. You can see all of these cases come together. Gideon versus Wainwright, and then Escobedo versus Illinois, and then Miranda versus Arizona. The Miranda rights speech that is given to people who are being arrested comes from the Supreme Court and that is part of common law. Those are precedents in those cases that change the behavior of the law enforcement, right? That's common law. All right, I know that's a little like dead air, but Some of these are complicated and I don't want to not give them to us. So we'll do this slide and then we'll end. So this will be the last slide for today. So we talked about, right, all of these cases. So the next part is these cases are so important, right? But not everything is decided to be picked up by the Supreme Court, right? Not everything in the Supreme Court is taken up, right? They choose the cases they pick up. So because it's so important, it's important to understand how they choose a case. And so there are 3 criteria. The first is controversy. Now, when you're talking about the Supreme Court, controversy means that circuit courts decided different things, right? Controversy in the Supreme Court means that you have the Ninth Circuit, the West Coast, the one we're in, the Ninth Circuit, says that, bans on same-sex marriage are unconstitutional. And then you have the Second Circuit or whatever circuits out in the East, and they say, no, bans on same-sex marriage are constitutional. There's no protection, there's no civil rights, there's no part of the Constitution that says you can't have bans on same-sex marriage. That's controversy. Now notice when I say controversy, it's not different beliefs, it's not different, it's that the circuit courts aren't aligned, right? All of the circuit courts should be saying the same thing. If all of the circuit courts said a ban on same-sex marriage is perfectly constitutional, there would be nothing for the Supreme Court to discuss because the law was clear enough that all of the district courts and all the circuit courts were aligned. So the only time that the Supreme Court really feels the need to engage is when the circuit courts aren't setting up, because it means there's something in the law that isn't clear, right? The Supreme Court deals with lack of clarity, right? So controversy occurs when it's not clear about what the law should be. And so the Supreme Court says, okay, this is a controversy between judges about how to interpret precedent, cases, and the Constitution. And so that's the first part. You need that part. The next part is standing. And this is why the Supreme Court can't just take up Roe v. Wade, right? Roe v. Wade will never be considered by the Supreme Court again because they're both dead, right? Or the original plaintiff, they're not around anymore. There's no one with standing. Now, there are other people that can replace them, right? You can have a new person who feels that, abortion rights have to be considered, right? But the thing is you need a woman who is pregnant to consider, right? That's one of the things, standing, right? Men cannot sue part of this, right? There are some legal Meninist groups, right, that say, right, they have a right over that individual, but the courts have already decided that this impacts women, right? Women are the ones who get pregnant, right? And because of that, if you are not impacted by law, you can't go to court. You have to be a woman, right, who is capable of having children, right, who might be impacted or is currently being impacted by the law. That's called standing, right? Now that case is very controversial, socially controversial, right? But when we're talking about saying it's that aspect, if you want to change, right, a law, it has to directly impact you, right? It has to directly impact you. That's called standing. It can be organizations too, but typically it's individuals or a state, right? And we call this a substantial stake in the outcome, right? A substantial stake. The other part is this idea of mootness, right? If the case no longer requires resolution, then it doesn't get considered. And this is by far the least sort of problematic, right? There used to be a case about shipping lanes because most ships had to follow, right? Older ships before the 20th century, older ships had to stay in shipping lanes. It was the only way to get back and forth across the Atlantic, right? You had to be in a shipping lane. Now ships continue to be in shipping lanes, but they're so large and sort of technologically advanced that they can exit a shipping lane in case there's an issue, right? So when we talk about shipping lanes, if it would create a safety issue for the vessel to leave the shipping lane, that used to be an issue that Supreme Courts would talk about, right? Is that an issue, right? Now there's no issue about it, right? The same thing is true for like Quaaludes. Quaaludes was a weird drug in the 20th century, right? Originally thought to have a medical purpose, right? All these things, but they don't exist anymore. There's no legal way to create them at all, right? So there's no question about production. Right? That's not a question that we concern ourselves with. Quaaludes were pharmaceuticals before they were recreational use drugs, right? But because they're not being created, because there's no legal way to produce them in a system, there's no questions about that, There's no questions to deal with, right? So that's moot, right? When you have something like that, it has to still impact people. It still has to still matter. It still needs to require resolution. So the first thing that happens is you get a right of certiorari, a writ, excuse me. And so with this writ, you have a paper that goes into a pool, right? And when it goes into this pool, it sort of gets randomly distributed to one of the Supreme Court justices. Do I continue to talk about this? Okay, good. This is just one slide. So once we're done with this slide. Okay. So what happens is there are 9 Supreme Court justices, and they're clerks, right? And so a case comes in that is possibly, right, usually the plaintiff or someone who is trying to appeal the Supreme Court, they take their case and they give it to the Supreme Court, and then it gets to this pool, and it gets sorted out and randomly goes to one of the justices. And then their clerks, the people who clerk for them, they write up and they tell their clerk, they say, okay, I read all the details of this case. And I think this case is something that you want to take up, right? Now, we already see some of the issue here is that if you are a very conservative judge and a case comes across that might not align with you, and you're the judge, the clerk is going to tell you, okay, this is not a case you want to take up. You don't want to deal with this. And what happens is that case just gets denied, right? So there's a randomization aspect that is somewhat problematic in the system. Then, if 4 of the 9 Supreme Justices decide to review a decision of a lower court, then it becomes a Supreme Court case. So before it ever goes to the Supreme Court, 4 of the individuals of the 9 have already decided this is something that needs to be reviewed, right? 4 of the 9 have already said be reviewed. And then this last part, this Rule 10, sometimes there are exceptions where a case goes directly to the Supreme Court, and this is special and compelling reasons, right? Elections go to the Supreme Court, right? That's special and compelling, right? Any election lawsuits will go straight to the Supreme Court. And it's up to the Supreme Court because part of the Constitution says the Supreme Court certifies the election, right? Its original jurisdiction is the election, right? So the part of this that I really want you to take this is when you have a case, it can't just be I'm going to the Supreme Court. There has to be reasons for it to go to the Supreme Court, right? You have to have a controversial decision, right? Circuit courts have to be deciding this differently. You have to have standing, right? If you are, 80 years old, you can't, right, engage in youth discrimination lawsuits and say it impacts you, right? There's no standing, right? In the same way that young people have trouble, right, would have a lot of trouble talking about ageist policies, okay? Elderly ageist policy, right? If you're 21 and you're saying that there's something ageist, that's not something that's going to really work for you. You're not going to really have standing until much later in your life. And the other part is not moot, right? If you're saying we need to regulate typewriters in the United States, right? The Supreme Court would say, no, typewriters aren't a thing anymore, right? That's a moot issue. We're not talking about that anymore, right? You want to say that the industry of candle making is a monopoly, right? The industry of candle making is a tiny fraction, right? Unless it was sort of ornamental candle making. So it has to be, it can't be moved. And then even when you have all of those things, like this decision isn't very clear. And we're going to see that there are a couple of cases coming up right now, right? In fact, one of them is about, could be about same-sex marriage. And one of the cases going through the courts right now. Is it controversial? Yes. If we get different decisions, it'll be controversial. Does it impact you? Yes. If you are part of a same-sex couple, whether or not you're allowed to legally marry impacts you. There's a substantial stake there, right? And then it's not, right? You're still trying to go through the marriage process. And so then when it goes to this pool, it's important to remember that the clerks have a lot of power about informing to their justices. And then the justices themselves also have a lot of power. And if it never goes to a discuss list, if it never gets supported by 4 of the Supreme Court, then it's not a case that's considered and the law doesn't change. So it takes a great deal of stuff to get to that point. Okay, I know I went over, we're not going to do any more slides. We're going to start on the flow of cases. This is sort of mentally for me. We'll talk about more of this. I did talk about ideologically driven clerks. We won't worry about that. We'll come back to this. We are a little behind, but I think that a couple of the last ones are very short, so I'm not worried about that. Before we go, your papers are due in like 8 hours, right? Some of you are going to watch this later, so it's not as helpful, but I have 14 papers in right now. There are something like 43 of you still in the class. If you don't turn in a paper, and I know I've been saying this a lot, and I know it's very repetitive, if you don't turn in a paper, you will not pass my class. And I have told you this over and over, it is due today. Give me something that I can grade, right? I don't mean just throw in some paragraphs and just throw me something. I will give you a 0, right? If you don't even make an attempt, I am not partial credit. I will give you a 0 if you don't really put in an effort. But if you write 4 pages, get into that 1 sentence on the 5th line, talk about the 3 articles, you will likely get a fairly good grade, right? Put in the effort, right? And you have enough time today. I know that there are other things on your schedule and some of you are working, but today is the very last day. I will not take papers after this day. I have a huge thing, a huge research project that I have to do before December 3rd. It's going to take a lot of my time. I designed the course to help me at the end of the semester because I have to dedicate more time to other things. I'm also doing that for you, right? So hopefully we both benefit. If you are struggling, I'm going to be on my computer all day today, right? From now until 11:30 at night, my email will be open. I will be available for chat. If you're having a problem, come talk to me, right? I will be available because I really want you to do this to the best of your ability, right? And so if you need to communicate with me and you don't like email, right, we can set up a WebEx, but also we can just go in the chat. It's not private. And we can email back and forth if privacy is concerned. But if you have a question about the paper, say, hey, can we talk in the chat? I want to sort of run something by you, right? I do want you to cover 3 of your articles, but remember, I care more about your language than your quotes, right? No quotes, right? Don't quote. Make sure you have in-text citation. Make sure I provided you with what I think a works cited should be, what the in-text citation should look like. Make sure you cite them, but don't quote, right? Tell me what, in your words, what you think they are saying. And I promise you, if you tell me in your words what you think they are saying, and you're off a little bit, your grade will still be significantly better than if you just post a paragraph quote, right? A big chunk of your paper being quotes means that shows to me that you're not trying to write a good paper, you're just trying to meet this minimum page requirement. I care less about that, right? Sometimes I mark you off a little bit for lack of page requirement, but it's because the limit on the pages is what's causing you to have a worse grade because you didn't cover enough material. So you have a big day today. On Saturday, everyone should know what their grade is and how they can change it. And I will write a personal email, not a block email, a personal email to every one of you explaining where you're at and what you can do, right? If you get that email and you're fine with where you're at, and you're fine with where you're at. If you're not happy or you're surprised, then talk to me. If you have an A after Saturday, I am telling you, if you have 3 exams in, and I'm saying right now, you have an A in the class, you have an A. That is the grade I will report. So on Saturday, some of you could have an A submitted, right? You're done here. So put in the effort, get through this, go to the next step. Okay. I know I said that a lot. I know I'm repetitive. I just want to get through this because the last part, I'm going to be very focused on those students who need help in some way. And so a lot of you will sort of exit this system after this week. So good luck. Have a great day. I know we're hitting the really hard part of the pandemic, so be safe. Be careful out there. Thank you.